Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for another story this evening. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I loved living in Alaska and being swathed by the comforting blankets of the natural world that swaddled me in her warm embrace, especially during the summer months. Alaska in spring and summer is postcard perfect, and the fine weather is ideal at this time of year. When summer arrives, so do all the bountiful opportunities for the locals and visitors to our part of the world alike, where you can enjoy the benefits of hiking, camping, fishing, sailing, and so much more, doing almost anything that tickles your fancy. In truth, I love Alaska all year round, as her dramatically theatrical seasonal changes can be very exciting, and a snow-covered Alaska is a picturesque wonderland. The gleaming white carpets of snow upholster everything without restraint, and anything the icy fingers of winter touches turns magically white. Let's not kid. To the naked eye, a white world can be spectacularly beautiful, but as is often the case, with every rose comes a nasty thorn. There are times that treacherously guileful cold weather can be your very worst enemy. It can be cruel and merciless, especially when the winter wind whips up the snow and it panels audaciously against your face, and icicles form on your lips and eyelashes, while your fingers and toes feel like frozen bullets that could so easily drop off. I have had frostbite twice in my life, so I know all about that. I also know a plethora of extraordinary confounding stories of people who enigmatically went missing in one of our uncongenial icy winter blizzards, never to be seen or heard from again. These tales are regretfully more commonplace than many would care to admit. Most Alaskans are aware that many people go missing from our part of the world every single year, especially within the Alaskan Triangle. It seems to go with the territory of living in an isolated wilderness, where unexplainable serendipitous things are just bound to happen. It's the not knowing what became of so many of these missing persons that bothers so many of us, when a person just mysteriously vanishes off the face of the earth without any plausible explanation. It certainly does raise more than a few incredulous eyebrows and gets the garrulous tongues in town wagging fiercely. Sometimes people see the missing person only seconds before they disappear. Then moments later they just vanish, almost as if they were swallowed up by the snow itself in one enormous big hungry mouthful. Ostensibly rumours abound that are as diverse and as seemingly colourful as a packet of minstrels as to what could have become of them. There are some people living here that are so practical, so rational, that they believe the missing person was more than likely killed by a wild animal, or slipped through the ice on a lake, and ended up freezing to death, being consumed by a cruel watery grave. While there are others, much like myself, that know unequivocally that some of the most outrageous things can happen out here, that those armed with a sceptical outlook would never ever believe in a million months of Sundays was plausible. My father used to say that those were the most naive, fleeceable people of all, who were not open to the fact that this world is not what it may seem. "They think they know it all," he would say, shrugging his shoulders sadly, as if commiserating with their callow ignorance. "They think that what you see is what you get. But they cannot see beyond the veil, the things in plain sight that only a discerning, astute eye will observe. They listen attentively to their geography and history masters, who tell them that this is all there is. They soak it all up, like a dupable, happy sponge, refusing to even conceive that they don't know it all. Of course, it's the intellectuals, the unsuspecting university professors, who are the most biased of all, caught up in the sticky silken web of their self-delusion. Their nescient minds are tightly closed to anything that does not fit their perfect paradigm-like bubble of the world. They discard anything that does not complement their belief system, spitting it out. I almost feel sorry for them, for it must be pretty miserable to believe that this is all there is. When your jejune mind is closed like that, there is no room for expansion, enlightenment, or the entertainment of much excitement or wondrous awe. For if you lock yourself up in a tight little matchbox and refuse to see beyond it, you're going to be as blind as a bat, and your little world you inhabit is going to be exactly as you expect it to be, like the food you order on the menu at the local tapas bar, predictable and unsurprising, unless, of course, the chef messes up your order. Suffice to say, most people know that Alaska is a magnet for strange, ambiguous, rather baffling events. I know people here who remain tight-lipped about some of their weird, outlandish experiences that have crossed their path, that they don't care to talk about. I doubt they ever will, lest they should be considered as nutty as a fruitcake. By all accounts, when something really wacko happens to you, and by wacko, I mean just that, wacko, it's easy to question your own sanity, to scratch your head doubtfully, and to say, did that really happen? It might not take long to persuade yourself that you must have been dreaming, for sometimes digesting what you know really did happen to you is like a big pill to have to swallow that gets stuck up in the back of your throat and simply will not go down, no matter how much you try to push it. You don't want to accept or believe it actually happened to you, even though it did. In a nutshell, if you can't believe what happened to you, how are you ever going to get anybody else to believe your account? I certainly get where people are coming from in this regard. I fully comprehend their desire to go to their graves, clutching their secrets tightly to their sides, like purses they don't want to be parted from, so that their secret will inevitably remain buried with them. I think it's a pity people don't talk, regardless what others may think of their accounts. But there you go. Each to his own, as my father always used to say. He was quite the philosopher, my dad. Over my lifetime living in Alaska as a highly inquisitive young boy, who always was looking for answers to my many questions, that I was to experience bizarre, paradoxical, illogical events that I could not explain, and many of them I might add. When strange things happened to me as a kid, I was much more accepting of the idiosyncratic and bizarre, possibly because my childlike imagination was open to Aslan the talking lion in Narnia, and the talking beavers in the illustrious children's book, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, whom they encountered when they slipped into a world, much like a snow-covered Alaska, beyond their wardrobe. I used to think if it can happen to them, it could happen to me, and it seems I wasn't wrong. I grew up in a wooden cabin about half an hour's drive from Fairbanks, although to my young eyes my ordinary home was a palace to me. I loved and appreciated every wooden beam that had been laid down by my father so lovingly to create our home. He built our cabin from scratch, from top to bottom, without any help, and I knew the love that had gone into its construction from every nail in the wood, and marvelled at my father's hard work, which made our wooden cabin all the more special to me. My creative mother did her best to make it as snug as a bug. She bought fabulous furnishings from Fairbanks, and all kinds of eclectic knickknacks that she found at local stores. My mother had an eye for the unusual, but I will say this about her: she had a great sense of style. She easily transformed our cabin into a sumptuous den. It was always the best feeling in the entire world to spend a morning out in the snow, riding our snowmobiles, to return to a warm cabin with a crackling fire in the hearth, and the delicious smell of home-baked bread wafting all over the cabin. In those days, I didn't know much about life in a big city. I had never visited a large, booming, spirited, lively metropolis like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, or Boston, and if I had, I think I would have appreciated all the more the idyllic sanctuary I was privileged to call my home. When I did visit New York for the first time in my life, while I welcomed the exciting buzz of a vibrant, electrifying city, the roar of the traffic, the honking taxicabs, the mixed tangle of people rushing to work every day, I found more than a little daunting. I knew from thenceforth that the stimulating life in a big city was not for me. It was pleasant to spend time in a booming metropolis, but it was better still to return to the peaceful sanctuary of our idyllic home life in Alaska, where the only traffic you might hear is the roaring wind, and the only honking sounds that did not come from yellow taxicabs, but wild Canada geese, crows or barred owls. Growing up, I had an older sister called Tabitha, but unfortunately she didn't survive past the age of 8. One day she went running across a frozen lake. The ice gave way to her, swallowing her up in a single freezing mouthful, like a hungry whale. My father tried to unavailingly rescue her, but when he ran across the lake after her, the ice began to heave and groan and break apart precariously, and my father very nearly ended up under the lake himself, in a watery grave. My desperate father had fruitlessly tried to get reinforcements to help Tabitha out, but by the time her body was removed from the lake, she was dead. She looked like a bedraggled rag doll. My parents had told her not to run over the lake, as some parts of it might not have been frozen solid yet, but my stubborn sister had a selective memory. She swore she'd seen a little white kitten on the ice that she needed to rescue. "Look, Mummy, white kitty," she said, scampering across the lake. "White kitty! I need to save the white kitty!" "Come back," my mother shouted. "Come back at once, Tabitha! It's not safe! The lake isn't all frozen!" But my sister did not listen. All she could think about was rescuing that kitten. Nothing else mattered to her, as my sister adored animals. Before my parents could stop her, she was autominously gone like lightning, racing across the lake, searching frantically for the white little kitten, calling out desperately, "Kitty! Kitty! Kitty!" oblivious to the danger she was in, and deaf to the urgent, persistent calls of my parents. They screamed, "Come back, Tabitha! There's no kitten there!" My father, who was not inclined to be angry, became belligerent, calling out to her, "Come back at once, Tabitha! Come on!" in his no-nonsense stern voice that usually got our attention, as it was rare for him to speak to us with an abrasive, commanding tongue. But my contrary sister just refused to listen, and then in our horror we watched her go plunging through the ice like a bullet, searing through bone and sinew. Of course, my family was devastated and lugubriously sorrowful over my sister's fortuitous passing. We never saw the kitten my sister claimed to have seen that day on the ice, and were sure she'd imagined it. But 2 days after her death, that was when we discovered a white kitten lying on our front doorstep, meowing to be let into our cabin. We brought her in, giving her the name Tabby, after my sister Tabitha. My mother believed Tabitha had sent us the white kitten. Maybe this was the white kitten she had seen on the ice, or the arrival of Tabby on our doorstep was just a mere coincidence. We couldn't be sure. My mother wept about Tabitha's unfortunate passing for several days, but then she and my father picked up the pieces of their lives and did not look back. I admired how stoically resilient they both were. My intrepidly tenacious parents had such a healthy, stout-hearted attitude towards death. My mother always used to say that when someone was gone, they were gone. There was no point living life in sorrow, as you can't change a thing. Your tears were not going to bring back the withered flower that died on you. I always tell myself, "We'll see Tabitha one day," she told me, so I refused to be sad. Tabitha wouldn't want us to be sad, would she? And besides, wherever she is, she'll be having a great time. If she was to see us crying, she'd be less inclined to be enjoying herself. She'd be commiserating with our grief, and I wouldn't want to do that to her. I became acquainted with death in Alaska, more than I would have been had I lived anywhere else in the world. I became aware that this is part of the natural rhythm of life, and the flow of everything. We are born, we live, and ultimately we die. None of us escape that harmonious flow. It'll happen to us all. I have seen old animals drop down dead in freezing conditions, when their bodies just packed up and decided enough was enough. Even a bird dropping out of a tree, lying there dead, or animals who didn't survive the winter hibernation. So yes, I am very familiar with death. In the end, it was me, my mother and my father and my grandfather Otis that made up my family. And for me, my grandfather was like a daddy senior, and my father was like my daddy junior. And I considered myself the luckiest boy in the world to live with 2 daddies. One day in early spring, I woke up excited to embrace the day. It was so beautiful. I bounced out of my bed with unbridled enthusiasm, like an excitable dog. I could feel 3 solid lumps on my bed weighing me down. I looked up to see our 3 cats, Tabby, Roly-Poly and Spotted Dick, all curled up together in a round ball. The latter both possess names after famous English puddings that I've personally tasted when I visited England once. They're delicious, I have to say. They say things are bigger in Alaska, and they're not wrong about that. Roly-Poly was an enormous cat, but she carried her weight rather well. My mother put her on a diet once, and her waistline only expanded after turning her attention to the rat population, when she decided that diet kibble just wasn't for her. So my mother promptly decided that putting Roly-Poly on a diet wasn't going to work. The rats were making her fatter than ever. The vet did not believe my mother when he claimed that she was clearly sneaking Roly-Poly some secret snacks, as our cat had willfully packed on still more weight. My mother protested her innocence. "I promise you, Doc, I've been giving Roly-Poly her diet kibble, but she hasn't been eating it." "Well, with the greatest of respect, Mrs. Feinstein, Roly-Poly hasn't packed on more pounds from eating just fresh air, has she? Someone's clearly been feeding her," he had chided, thinking presumptuously that he knew it all. We were soon to discover a stack of rat bones on the corner of our cabin, several dozen rats' tails and decapitated rats' heads, all clustered together in an unsightly heap. Then we discovered the offender of these macabre murders, Roly-Poly, who was lying on the ground, chowing through a big rat, as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. She had mutinously declared war on the diet kibble, and she had won the long drawn-out battle. My mother said, "Right, that's it. No cat of mine is living on rats." So she threw out the diet kibble in disgust, and Roly-Poly gladly returned to her original diet. So soon the decapitated heads and the rats' tails became a thing of the past. Spotted Dick was a cat with unusual spotted markings on him, hence his name, and growing up these 3 cats were very special to me. We also had a large greyhound called Sophie, and she was the gentlest giant you've ever seen. She was the most easygoing character, and chilled like my father. They both had such a gentle energy. It was hardly a wonder that Sophie bonded with my father and attached herself to him like superglue. They were like 2 peas in a pod. Sophie followed my father everywhere he went, and even accompanied him to town on the back of his truck. When I used to watch Sophie running across the snow, she looked like a silvery ghost. It was quite transfixing to watch her, especially in winter. She looked quite spectral at times. So let's get back to my story. I woke up on a day that was typically like any other day. I was not expecting anything out of the ordinary or untoward to happen. The day didn't seem to be clandestinely hiding a secret from me. In truth, the day was dressed in its customary apparel and seemed as honest and as forthcoming as it always was. The trees weren't whispering in the breeze, and there was nothing deceitful about the pretty bird song that I could hear from outside my bedroom window. I was excited getting out of bed, as springtime meant I could go exploring, and my father had said we could go fishing in the morning. Better still, Grandpa Otis would come along for the adventure, as he enjoyed a spot of fishing. Let's just say, back in the prime of his life, he had been quite the fisherman. He had taught my father everything he knows about fishing, who in turn had taught me. The previous night, my grandfather Otis had been expressing his desire to go fishing. "It's been a long, drawn-out winter. My old bones didn't take it too good this year, I'm afraid. These winters can be something tough, they can. With springtime here, I fancy a spot of sun shining down on my old face, sitting there on the fishing pier again, with an icy cold beer in my hands while I fish. There ain't nothing better than that, let me tell you. I mean, who says you need to meditate when you go fishing? That's what it's all about, ain't it? Relaxing, breathing in the fresh air, and grabbing a big old fish for the ride." My father had thoroughly agreed with him. "Well, that's settled then. The 3 of us will set off for the lake in the morning. We will be back before lunch. "Hopefully we can grace your frying pan with our freshly caught fish," he said to my mother, with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. My mother murmured, "Now that would be nice, very nice. We haven't had freshly caught fish for a while." No one said anything, but you could hear the sound of everybody's stomachs grumbling in eager anticipation. As freshly caught fish, my father would always say, "There ain't anything quite like it. Touch of pepper and salt, melted butter, garlic and lemon, and you've got a feast fit for a king." I remember a soft sunlight was filtering through the cabin window, washing everything in a congenial radiance, as we sat down to enjoy a not-so-hearty breakfast. I say that as we used to start our days with only a light snack. The kitchen was always lovely and warm, as we had an oil-fired oven in there, one of those cast-iron old-fashioned numbers that kept the cabin cosy during the winter months, most especially. I don't think you can buy an oven like that anymore. It's probably obsolete and belongs more in an antique store, but it worked just fine when I was a boy, and if I saw one again, I'd buy it in a heartbeat. Some of those old stoves, they were the absolute best. "Are you ready to go fishing, George?" my father had said to me when I entered the kitchen, wearing my long khaki shorts, my long socks and flannel top, along with a broad grin on my face. I couldn't help it. I was so excited. The idea of a morning fishing session with my father and Grandpa Otis was just perfect. It didn't get better than this. I could feel my heart fluttering with ebullient anticipation, as if thousands of butterflies were flapping inside me. I visualized myself with an enormous fish at the end of the line. How I had dreamed about that once-in-a-lifetime king-sized catch. My mother had told me when I caught my first enormous fish, she would proudly blow the photograph of me up, holding my massive conquest, and hang it pride of place on the wall, next to the pictures of my dad and Grandpa Otis with their fishing trophies. My father had caught a massive 95-pound sturgeon once. There was a picture of him holding the fish, and a similar picture of my grandfather with a huge 120-pound halibut. I also wanted to be on that Hall of Fame. "Wait until you catch your first monster fish," Grandfather Otis would tell me. "You will swell with pride, young man, and I mean literally swell." I wasn't sure what he meant. I didn't like the idea of swelling. I hope it didn't mean I'd grow a big belly, like some of the men that frequented the town bar, whose tummies all looked terribly swollen. I watched my father smothering his toast with butter and jam, and knocking it all back with a hot cup of coffee. "It's a fine day for fishing," my dad had said. "We're going to enjoy it out there this morning. The weather is just fine today." My grandfather entered the room with an incredulous look on his face. I could see he was dressed for fishing, in his long khaki shorts and matching cotton top. But there was something about his demeanour that gave me pause for thought. He looked as if he was hiding words on his lips that he was reluctant to share. Words that did not smell sweet, like a fragrant breeze, but ominous words that ponged like a bad smell. My grandfather looked good for his years in terms of his body. Indeed, if I was his age, I would be quite pleased with my physique. He walked well, was as fit as a fiddle, with a back as straight as a pencil. But the only thing that revealed his age was his weathered skin, his full white beard, and his full head of white hair, which was often covered with a red bandana. I used to love how his blue eyes would stare at me through those wrinkles that so wilfully trespassed across his face, giving him that wizened appearance. "Is something wrong, Otis?" asked my mother, who was attacking a big ball of dough and lining it into a pan in order to make the daily bread. "It's this," said my grandfather, rolling up his sleeve reluctantly. We gathered around him nonplussed. My mother let out an audible gasp. "Goodness, that looks like a malignant melanoma. How long have you had that for?" "That's the thing," said my Grandpa Otis. "I have no recollection of having seen this before. I'm sure I should have noticed it." "Well, it's been winter, hasn't it?" said my mother. "We've all been wearing long sleeves. Maybe you didn't notice it." "What's a malignant melanoma?" I asked my mother. My mother sounded guarded. "I'm not saying Grandpa Otis has got a malignant melanoma, because I can't be sure. But I was a nurse once, and I know about these things. This mole looks awfully suspicious. It's uneven in size. It's got strange colours." "What is a malignant melanoma?" I asked again. "It's a mole that might be cancerous," she told me. "But it's nothing to worry about. It needs to be looked at right now, because it might need to be cut out at once, and then they'll send the mole off for a biopsy to check that it isn't cancerous. That's a normal protocol. I'm quite sure everything's going to be just fine. It's in a conspicuous place, and for your Gramps not to have noticed it until now suggests to me that it hasn't been around for very long, and that in itself is very good news." "By Jove," said my grandfather, "isn't life strange? I can't understand why I never saw this before. This thing is a hell of an ugly. Good job they'll be cutting it out." "Is Grandpa going to be all right?" I asked. "Of course, sweetheart," said my mother, wrapping me in her arms reassuringly. "What about our fishing trip?" I asked, realizing that my plans for the day had gone up in smoke and were heading south. I could feel my small little heart sinking like a stone, being plunged into a large body of water and nose-diving to the very bottom. I'd been so looking forward to this, me and my dad and my Grandpa Otis gathered together around the lake, soaking up the sun, pulling in some fine catches of the day. We would then gut them with our sharp knives, and my mother would cook them for lunch when we got back to the cabin. I had been aching for our adventure. It was suddenly like the sky of my day had clouded over in a plethora of pewter clouds and become very grim, very disappointing. "We'll have to take a rain check, son," said my father. "I need to take your grandfather into town to get his mole checked out. I'm very sorry," he said, rubbing an affectionate hand through my white curls. "Still, it can't be helped. These things happen." My grandfather was muttering to himself, "By Jove, I didn't notice it until now. How could I have missed it?" He sounded a little irked with himself, but he was sympathetic towards my plight. "I didn't want to say anything, George. I know you were looking forward to our fishing adventure, but I can't ignore a mole like this. I'm sure you appreciate that." "It doesn't matter, Gramps. You need to check out your mole to make sure you're all right." I sorrowfully watched my father and Grandfather Otis climb into my father's Land Rover, with Sophie jumping enthusiastically onto the back seat, looking decidedly content. Her grey tail was wagging profusely, and she let out a few little woofs as if to say to my dad, "Go on, what are you waiting for?" My father started up the engine, and his Land Rover happily purred down our driveway, and was gone from my sight. And as his truck disappeared, I suddenly felt very sorry for myself. It wasn't fair. I'd so wanted to go fishing, and now this had to happen to throw a spanner in the works. It was soul-destroying. "So what are you going to do this morning?" my mother asked me. "I've some things to do in the kitchen. Would you like to lend a hand, George? I'm going to make some apple pie and some stew and dumplings. Would you like to help me? You could perhaps start by peeling the apples for me." I couldn't think of anything worse than lending a hand in the kitchen. That was boring. The only nice part about cooking was when you got to lick out the remains of the cake mix left in the bowl. But beyond that, it was drudgerously dull. Unless, of course, it came to frying up a freshly caught fish and watching it being thrown into a pan with butter, lemon and garlic. That was different. I always felt accomplished when I caught something and enjoyed eating it afterwards. And believe me, nothing tastes better than freshly caught fish. "I'm going to play outdoors. I don't want to peel your apples for you. As long as you don't venture too far from the cabin," my mother had said. It was when I ambled outside our cabin. I found myself gravitating towards our sizable outhouse, where we stored all our sporting accessories, our snowmobiles, our kayaks, hiking equipment, and stuff like that. I saw my fishing gear that my father had prepared for me the previous night, ready to go for our morning excursion. I suddenly had a great epiphany. Yes, it was disappointing that my grandfather and my dad had gone to Fairbanks and could not come fishing with me. That was a bummer, but there was no reason I couldn't go alone. Goodness gracious, I was a big boy now. I didn't need to be supervised all the time. I was 10 years old already, and quite a proficient fisherman at that. Grandpa Otis said I was better than he was at fishing when he was my age. And if that was indeed true, I was going to be better than both my father and my grandfather. The lake was a brief walk through the woods, not too far from our cabin. And imagine what Father and Grandpa Otis would say when they came back from Fairbanks to discover my mother cooking up the fish I'd caught for lunch. I visualized my fish lining the pan, swathed in butter and a delicious garlicky smell that lingered audaciously through the kitchen, inviting taste buds to tingle with delight and stomach muscles to twitch and rumble in eager anticipation. I could see my mother beaming from ear to ear with a smile on her face that was so big it could barely fit. "Look what George caught while you were in Fairbanks. He went fishing all on his own. Isn't he an industrious young man?" I could see my grandfather smiling through his sparkling blue eyes at me. "You're not wrong there. George is quite the fisherman." My father would look as pleased as Punch. "My son is a very adept young man. This is an impressive catch indeed. I could never have done that at his age, and to think he did this without our supervision. The mind boggles." As I stood there imagining my father and my grandfather Otis, their celebratory reactions to my fishing accomplishments, I could feel my chest pump up, like a flat tire that had suddenly been filled with air. I felt puffed up and proud. Yes, I would show my family what a remarkable, proficient fisher boy I was. I knew my mother was busying herself in the kitchen, wearing a housecoat with her hands probably caked in flour by now, as she began to knead her dough, while the cats were still lying curled up on my unmade bed, locked up in the blissful, contented world of their dreams, where no doubt they were off catching mice, climbing trees, or stalking unsuspecting birds. I took a camping chair, my fishing rod, and my little wicker basket with me into the woods, and off I went on my merry way. I felt blissfully happy and very contented. The former disappointment I had first felt when my father had put an end to my plans was now overtaken by the thrill of a riveting expedition that I would undertake all on my own. There was something rather fragrant, very appealing, about embarking on your own little daredevil excursion. I was small, so carrying a fishing rod and my supplies was a daunting task, but not for a young boy that was wearing a fat ego, heavier than the stuff I was carrying. My fishing rod was made of fiberglass. It was 3 to 4 foot long, a medium-power rod, I believe it was. The day was extraordinarily beautiful. I mean beautiful. Bird song filtered through the valley. A collection of tweets, warbles and whistles serenaded my approach. Then there were the buzzing sounds of insects, especially bees and pretty butterflies, that bobbed from one flower to another. The woodgrove was so welcoming, as the sun's soft, effusive shadows of light cast their pretty prisms through the tall, towering trees that were predominantly spruces, hemlocks, cedars, cottonwoods, and paper birches. The ground was carpeted in purple trilliums, along with splatterings of dog-tooth violets and the occasional yellow lily. I ambled happily through the woodgrove, and the woody scent of the terpenes from the pine needles was very refreshing and uplifting, along with the fragrant smell of wild flowers. My sneakers crushed the forest debris under my feet as I walked, so I could hear twigs cracking, snapping and popping. I ambled towards the lake. I stood still for a moment, to stare in awe at the exquisite scenery that met my eyes. The prepossessing turquoise-blue lake twinkled in the morning light, with the silhouettes of the spruce trees clustered together, mirrored on its reflectant surface. In the background was the undulating sweep of the mountains. The lower part of the mountains were carpeted in a viridescent green, but as they ascended into the sky, with their sculptural majesty, in sweeping curls and folds, they became greyer and more subdued, while the deep ridges and crevices at the very top were sprinkled liberally with snow. I stared up at the sky. I swear it was so blue. There wasn't a single cloud in sight. I charged over to the wooden fishing pier, with an eager skip to my step. It had been there long before my father had built the cabin. It was old, and had been exceedingly well built, by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. It was solid and robust, as it had been the day it had first been built. But then again my father had ensured he treated the wood every year, and I guessed that helped to keep it in peak condition. I pulled out my camping chair and cast out my rod, as I sat down to enjoy the feel of the sun washing over my face. So there you are, That's the end of part 1. Tomorrow is part 2, and it's a very exciting story, so don't miss it. Until next time, goodbye and good night.